Dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Dok genocid u Gazi ulazi u novu fazu, broj žrtava konstantno raste, a svijet svjedoči zločinu bez presedana. U ovoj epizodi Granica istoka donosimo detaljnu analizu trenutne situacije, od šutnje Evropske unije i međunarodne zajednice do uloge regionalnih i globalnih aktera. Kakva je sudbina civila pod stalnim bombardovanjem? Koje poruke šalju međunarodne organizacije i kakvi su diplomatski pokušaji zaustavljanja izraelske agresije? Lisa Hadjar, profesorca na Univerzitetu u Kaliforniji, dugi niz godina analizira konfliktne zone i globalne reakcije. Sa njom sam razgovarao o studentskim protestima u SAD-u, gušenju protesta solidarnosti i šutnji evropskih zemalja, naročito Njemačke. Professor Lisa, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to start by asking you, you have extensively written and researched the legal frameworks of conflict in conflict zones. How would you interpret the current legal and political debates around labeling Israeli crimes in Gaza as genocide, and what are the implications of this framing for international law and accountability?
Well, what's happening in Gaza is indisputably a genocide, and the only reason people rebuff that labeling is because they don't want the accountability that comes with that. So if one is looking at what's happening on the ground, the intentional destruction of Palestinian society, mass killing, the starvation policy, etc., all of these things are intentional policies perpetrated by the Israeli government with the intent to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza. The rhetorical justification, which is not even plausible, is that Israel is only going after Hamas. But the scale of destruction and death makes that farcical, except for people who are persuaded ideologically to not see the truth.
If Israel was given the opportunity to apply the same tactics on Palestinians living in the West Bank, would it do so?
This particular regime, in the Netanyahu regime, it's the most right-wing government that Israel's ever had, and that's saying something. But so the people who populate the leadership positions in the government are ardently, openly hostile and hate Arabs and Palestinians. They see a Jewish-Israeli destiny as conquering and having exclusive control over the whole country. So if you see the settler violence going on unimpeded in the West Bank, it's it's sort of a smaller scale dimension, but it's all part of a larger phenomenon to sort of erase Palestinian political existence in their historic homeland and to maximize Israeli control.
Now, much of your work addresses the normalization of exceptional legal practices such as military courts, administrative detention, and torture. How have these practices contributed to an environment in which systemic violence against Palestinians is rendered justified in the mainstream discourse.
Right. Well, I would never say that it's normalized. What I refer to is when governments or government lawyers argue that the kind of practices that they want to engage in or that they are engaging in don't violate the law. What I would say is they legalize it, and you have to have the scare quotes. So it's a matter of reinterpreting the law in order to try and bring the law as it's understood by the state to cover the kinds of practices that states want to do. So we've looked at Israel has a long record of having legalized torture, and after 9/11, the United States borrowed almost letter and down to the letter the Israeli model to legalize torture. But it is this. I mean, one of the things I think is very important, and this even goes back to your first question, is that governments, governments that pride themselves on having a reputation for being respectful of the rule of law, those are the kind of governments that need to bother trying to reinterpret the law. Pure authoritarian dictatorships don't even bother. They don't try to frame what they're doing as legal, but it's Israel, the United States, and other countries that want to do things that violate the law, but they want to make it seem as though it's not illegal, so they reinterpret the law.
Now, we know that racism and dehumanization are often identified as root factors enabling mass violence. We've seen it in the Balkans 30 years ago, say today in Palestine. How do you understand the mainstreaming of anti-Palestinian racism, both in Western media, but also in Western policy circles, in think tanks?
Well, the history of U.S. anti-terrorism law was always targeted against Palestinians, going back to the 1970s when the PLO was singled out as this as a terrorist organization, and so U.S. Anti-terrorism laws literally developed with Palestinians as the sort of model. So there's a kind of baked-in anti-Palestinianness in U.S. counterterrorism, and because of the influence, global influence of the United States, when the United States sort of constructs a counterterrorism arguments and laws, other countries will copy them. I mean, in the case of Israel, though, it is a sort of, the Israeli, political position has always been, because there's a, who gets to control this land, who lives there. They construe Palestinians as an inherently existential threat. And so by perceiving of Palestinians as an existential threat and then framing that threat as terrorism, ends up justifying a lot under the mantle of national security. So in the context of Israel and Palestine, anti-Palestinianness is very much rooted in the kind of historical conditions. But the anti-Palestinianness that we're seeing, for example, governments like Germany and some governments that are without hesitation supporting everything Israel.
Yes, how do you make sense of Germany's anti-Palestinian stance? Well,
because, Germany, in the case of Germany, because of the Holocaust, the significance of the Holocaust to post-World War II Germany, there's, laws on the books in Germany that no one can compare the Holocaust to anything. So that actually is a completely anti-intellectual position. It means that, for anybody to invoke a genocide somewhere else or to even analogize what, happened, the kind of the eliminationist politics of the Nazis to other governments anywhere, eliminationist politics, it defies German law. But also Germany sees itself, because of the Holocaust, as having a special role in propping up and supporting Israel, right or wrong. So that goes a long way towards explaining the German position on this.
And still having a guilty feeling back to the Holocaust and allowing the Israelis to take it out on the Palestinians in a way.
Well, it's not just a guilty feeling. It's kind of it's German politics and law that enshrine these kind of things, and it's illegal to compare the Holocaust. This is why, the attacks on freedom of speech and academic freedom in Germany are very much linked to this notion that it is utterly unacceptable in Germany to call any other Holocaust a Holocaust or any other genocide, compare it to the Holocaust, because that would diminish the unique significance of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was uniquely significant, but we can, as intellectuals, we can basically think comparatively. And the Genocide Convention was, the Genocide Convention was the first human rights law. It was created in 1948. It had the German Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust as its model. And so that also has lent itself to certain limitations on applying the Genocide Convention or enforcing the Genocide Convention to other kind of contexts, because it was very much tailored to the industrial, explicitly racialized extermination policy of the Nazis.
Well, now, in recent years, there has been, an intensification of efforts to police, but also to silence pro-Palestinian voices, especially in university campuses in Europe, but also in the US. How do these repressive strategies intersect with the wider trends in law and society, and what risks do they pose for academic freedom in the West?
Well, I think that the clamping down on First Amendment protected political speech, because the government, and this is a bipartisan phenomenon. The Biden administration is not much different than the Trump administration on this notion that standing up for Palestinian rights or being critical of Israeli state policies is somehow, anti-Semitic, and therefore violates the things that America stands for. So it poses enormous risks for academic freedom and the constitutional protection of the First Amendment. But I would also say, if you ask, in a sense, why? One of the ironies in the United States is that Trump himself and many of the people in his administration are purely anti-Semitic. Elon Musk and others, but they're using the allegation that standing up for Palestinian rights or criticizing Israeli mass killing of Palestinians is somehow anti-Semitic, which is in fact itself anti-Semitic, because if you argue that it's Jewish to perpetrate genocide, that is anti-Semitic. So, but the irony is they're using this sort of as a club to attack, the heads of people who are critical of these kind of policies.
And now, looking at the broader historical record, what do you think Palestinians can learn from Bosniak Muslims in fighting for justice and accountability before international tribunals? And what avenues remain open for Palestinians, to fight for their rights on a global scale?
Well, the aftermath of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and what you're talking about, the fighting for accountability in the context of Bosnia and elsewhere, was literally the birth of what we now call international criminal law. There really wasn't any there was international law, yeah, but trying to actually mobilize it against individuals who perpetrated gross crimes, really, it was born of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as well as the International Tribunal for Rwanda in the 1990s. And so everything in the world we now look at as international criminal law and efforts to hold people to account for war crimes, genocide, etc., owes some kind of a debt to the fight that happened in this part of the world.
Right. Lisa, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
U složenom ratu informacija, izvještavanje o Gazi često je podložno manipulacijama i političkom pritisku. U nastavku razgovaramo sa profesorom Cemilom Aydinom, koji istražuje kako globalni mediji prikazuju sukob, na koji način propaganda utječe na percepciju javnosti, te kakve su posljedice dezinformacija. Ko zapravo ima moć da oblikuje istinu, a ko gubi glas u vrtlogu geopolitičkih interesa? Professor Cemil, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you, Harun. It's an honor to be in Sarajevo, and it's in this beautiful city, which has a very, of course, sad history of genocide. That's why it's very meaningful that we had the meeting of Gaza Tribunal in Sarajevo. Now,
Professor, you have written extensively about the historical construction of the Muslim world and global perceptions shaped by imperial narratives. How would you situate the current American and broader Western perceptions of Palestine within these larger, longer intellectual and political histories? And to what extent do you think Orientalist frameworks continue to inform mainstream understanding of the Palestinian issue in the United States, for example?
Yeah. No, that's a great beginning, Harun, for understanding today's crisis. So, in the past, when there was a genocide, let's say genocide against Namibians by Germany, or all the violence that the European colonialists had in Congo or other parts of Africa, we make a connection between racism and genocide. The argument is that European empires were racist towards African, and this kind of racism is a skin color-based racism. The black African Americans were enslaved. But what we see with the genocide, both in Bosnia but in Palestine, there are new language of racializations to justify the genocide that make reference to history, to religion. We know from the genocide of Bosnian Muslims that the Serbian nationalists did this genocide on behalf of European civilization, and they targeted Muslims as a group that do not belong to Europe, that needs to be expelled from Europe. Contemporary Israeli government has two styles of anti-Palestinian racism to justify their genocide, two strategies, which both revolves around the question of civilization. One of them is this brute colonial one, to say that Palestinians are barbaric and semi-civilized, and Israel represents the civilization, and this is a battle between light and civilizations against backwardness and barbarism. That's, of course, is almost like clock returned back almost 150 years to mid-19th century, like European colonialists in Australia, Tasmania, to destroy everything. As sinister as this first one, the second strategy to justify or to sell to sell the genocide to Europeans is the language of clash of civilizations. And that became more successful.
Now, Professor, in the wake of recent campus protests and repression of pro-Palestinian activism at American universities, what parallels do you see compared to earlier movements of student-led advocacy such as anti-apartheid and anti-war movements back in the 60s and 70s? And what might this reveal about the perceived legitimacy of Palestinian voices in the United States?
That's a good question. I have been living in the United States since 1994, and since 1994, I always worked at the university, either as a student and as a professor. And I have seen campus activism and protests about Bosnia. I do remember just on the week of Srebrenica massacre, we did a protest, a memorial at the steps of Harvard Library. In those times, even after September 11, we did not see this much of pressure, violence towards students. This means that the recent student protest about Israel's legitimacy targeted the core of post-World War II Western liberal international order, which was based on a fiction, a myth that Europeans were wrong maybe at some point with Nazis and with colonialism, but they had a moral awakening. They changed. The best example is Germany. Germany said, I apologize for my past crimes. And the Americans also did the same thing. They said that, we were racist in the past, but we have a progress. They made Obama the president. But now we realize that all of this myth about the Western moral progress relied on a couple of crucial lies about Palestinians and Israel. And then as these lies are exposed and challenged by students, university administrators and the politicians became more cruel. They couldn't come up with any argument with free speech, so the only way they could think of doing this is to silence by sheer repression. I think that was also the strategy for the pro-Israeli groups. They said that any critic of Israel should be demonized as anti-Semitic and racist and should be banned. So what we have seen in the last 2 years is a surprise for all of us. We haven't expected this much of abandonment of all the values of the universities and this much of repression and pressure. It was much easier to criticize, for example, America after September 11, where America was attacking Iraq and Afghanistan, than now to criticize Israel.
Professor, since you mentioned protests during the war in Bosnia, I wanted to ask you, how do you compare the reactions of the Muslim majority countries during the genocide in Bosnia and and later on in Kosovo with that of Palestinians today, is there an equal level of Muslim solidarity towards the Palestinian cause today, or are people becoming to face some sort of fatigue when it comes to the Palestinian cause?
Well, in terms of the populations, there is, of course, a level of solidarity and understanding. With current Palestine question, I do not think that the Arab publics are indifferent. They do realize what's happening. And it's also a question of being human, right? In addition to being Muslim, meaning that Palestinians are racialized and they're attacked as Muslim, although there are Christian Palestinians. That's a kind of strategy for Israel. And the situation of Palestine has something to do with European colonial strategies and racism towards Muslims, right? So that British knew that this was a Arab majority place, but then they forcefully created this ethnic state, Israel. So when Britain was actually the ruling majority of the Muslims, so that sort of has something to do with racism towards Muslims. So the question is that were Muslims more supportive of Bosnian compared to Palestinians? I think not necessarily so. I think there is enough sufficient mobilization. The big difference is that Israel is much stronger than Serbians, and Israel is under the full military protection of the United States, the biggest military superpower in the world. This is not a war between only just Israel and Palestinian people. Israel is insured and backed by U.S. military, which has a $1 trillion military budget. So you're basically a very unjust situation, and that which also teaches us that the United States and partly Europe, like Germany, when they decide to commit a crime, to do something unjust and unlawful, there is nothing to restrain and stop them. That all the international institutions and international rules and regulations do not apply them. So the Palestine question, actually, the recent inability of no one or the global public opinion to stop the genocide actually exposed the crisis and the bankruptcy of the so-called rule-based international order.
Mm-hmm. Now, media representation plays quite a significant role in shaping public opinion. From your perspective as a historian living in the United States, how have media narratives in the U.S. contributed to the framing of Palestinians, of Palestinian resistance and pro-Palestinian activism over the last 1.5 years?
Yeah, this is another realization we had, is how much of American media relied on this distorted stories about Palestinians as anti-Western and violent, and Israel is an ally of the liberal Western civilized values. So the American media did not do its job. That's for sure, especially the mainstream media. The only difference now is that we have social media and there's alternative media. What they did is unbelievably unacceptable. There's more freedom in Russia to criticize Russian invasion of Ukraine than the spaces for criticizing Israel and America on this issue. In fact, Israeli media like Haaretz are actually ahead of American media institutions. So it was very shameful. I mean, other than a couple of social media voices, American media was complicit in this narrative. Now, I do think that the roots of this is going back to Cold War, and that's, I think, what Edward Said was indicating with his book on Orientalism, and then writing about covering Islam, which was media depictions of Muslims. What Edward Said was saying, which now we better realize, is that racism that can happen through media narratives is not a cause of genocide and violence, but a result of it. Meaning that racism does not stem from ignorance of other people or cultural unfamiliarity. Racism is manufactured as a justification of an uneven, unjust situation. So as Israel is doing this genocide and you have to defend Israel, the only avenue is available is to deny the Palestinian humanity and to depict their resistance or their struggle as anti-Western, anti-Semitic Islamic revolt, right? So this type of media framing is a result of a political choice that America is behind Israel, and that's how they can only justify it.
Professor Jamilu, such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you, Harun. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Ispod srušenih zgrada i u sjeni granata nalaze se priče o otporu. Otpor koji nadilazi vojnu borbu izražava se kroz svakodnevni život, očuvanje identiteta, kulture i nade. Uprkos razaranjima, gubicima i nepravdi, Palestinci uporno čuvaju dostojanstvo, solidarnost i vjeru u budućnost. Njihov otpor je prije svega borba za pravo na život, slobodu i samoodređenje. Gaza nije samo mjesto patnje, već i simbol nepokolebljive volje jednog naroda da opstane i očuva svoj identitet. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pogledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.